when a diner owner violently shoved an 8 months pregnant Marine widow into the parking lot. He thought he was just another petty tyrant winning a small battle. He had no idea what he was getting into. He didn't know that this specific widow was protected by a code deeper than the law. I'm known as Joe, and I'll be the narrator of this story. If you're new to our channel, please subscribe to help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. The wind in rural Pennsylvania has a particular bite in late October. It screams down from the Appalachians, a mournful sound that promises a hard winter, and it finds every crack in the old farmhouse. On the porch, a 10-year-old boy named Leo tries to nail a loose board back into place. The hammer is too heavy for him, the nails are rusty, and the wood is rotted through. He is small for his age, with oversized worn-out gloves that were once his grandfather's. The farm is dying. You can see it in the peeling white paint of the house, the gray, fallow fields, and the splintered bones of the fence line he is hopelessly trying to mend. His name is Leo. He is trying to save a world that is already gone, holding back an ocean of debt with nothing but his own small hands. He lives here with his grandmother, Sarah, a woman whose spirit is as worn down as the treads on her work boots. Before we dive deeper into Leo's fight, I want to know where you are watching this from. Drop your city and country in the comments right now. Leo doesn't know you are watching. He only knows the cold. He only knows the foreclosure notice taped to the kitchen door. It's red ink looking like a wound, and the auction date that is approaching like a freight train. Sarah is not a weak woman. She is a woman who has been systematically broken. She is a widow, crushed by the medical debts her husband left behind after the mines hollowed out his lungs. The bank, the local community trust in town, had been understanding for a year. Now their understanding had run out, replaced by the sterile, impersonal language of liens and seizures. She spends her nights at the kitchen table, a single dim light illuminating the stacks of blue-windowed envelopes. The clicks of her old calculator are the only sound, a tiny, desperate tapping against an avalanche of numbers she can never hope to defeat. At school, Leo is a ghost. He's the farm kid, the boy who smells faintly of hay and the wood smoke from their stove. The other children, with their new sneakers and bright, clean coats, treat him like a stain. Their cruelty is not always loud. It is the quiet, insidious cruelty of exclusion. He eats his lunch alone at the far end of the cafeteria, his sandwich wrapped in wax paper, watching the other children trade snacks from colorful packages. He has learned to make himself small, to be invisible. It is the only defense he has against a world that sees his poverty as a personal failure, as something contagious they might catch. There is one, however, who prefers his cruelty loud: Mark Hemmings. Mark is 12, and he wears his father's status like a new jacket. His father is the manager at the Community Trust Bank, the same man whose signature is on the notice on Leo's door. Mark understands power in a way Leo does not. He knows who is weak. "Heard you'll be living in a cardboard box soon, farm boy," Mark sneered just yesterday, shoving Leo against the brick wall of the gymnasium. "My dad's gonna own your dirt." Leo just fixed his glasses, the shame burning hotter than the anger he knew he was not allowed to feel. But the bitterness of the world has not poisoned Leo. It has in some strange way made him profoundly gentle. He carries a quiet, desperate empathy for things that are broken. He finds birds with broken wings and tries to splint them with twigs and thread. He shares his own meager lunch, the part he doesn't eat, with a skeletal stray dog that haunts the edge of the property. He knows what it feels like to be hungry, to be cold, to be looked at with pity or disgust. This knowledge has not hardened his heart. It has made him heartbreakingly, dangerously soft in a world that eats soft things alive. The farm is beyond saving. The old tractor, a rusted green relic from the 70s, sits dead in the barn, its engine block cracked. The silo leans at a precarious angle, a monument to a prosperity that feels like ancient history. The dairy cows were sold 6 months ago to pay the property taxes, and the money is already gone. Sarah tried. She sold pies at the farmer's market. She mended clothes for people in town. But it was like trying to fill a bucket with a hole in it. The land itself seems exhausted, depleted, as if it has given up alongside the people who work it. The date on the refrigerator is not a suggestion. It is an execution order. In 7 days, the farm, his grandfather's legacy, and the only home Leo has ever known, will be auctioned on the county courthouse steps. This is not a dramatic, cinematic foreclosure. It is a mundane, bureaucratic killing. Mr. Hemmings, Mark's father, no longer takes Sarah's calls. He sees the property not as a home, but as a distressed asset. He sees the fields as future plots for a housing development. The land that holds 3 generations of Leo's family is just a number on a balance sheet, and that number is finally due. The town of Millers Creek offers no comfort. This is the heartland, but its heart seems to have gone cold. They are not bad people. They are just tired people, consumed by their own quiet struggles, afraid to look too closely at Sarah's misfortune in case it is contagious. They see her failure as a warning, a result of bad luck or poor management. They lower their eyes when she passes in the grocery store. This isolation is the true terror. It is the chilling, absolute certainty that no one is coming to help. They are completely, devastatingly alone against the coming storm. Leo still has one secret, a small, irrational hope. Tucked in a dusty coffee can in his grandfather's old workshop is his savings. It is a small hoard of coins he has found in the dirt, quarters from couch cushions, and a few crumpled dollars he earned helping a neighbor stack firewood last summer. It totals $27.45. In his 10-year-old mind, it is a fortune. He believes, with the fierce, illogical faith of the truly desperate, that this money can change things. He just does not know how. It is the only weapon he has, a tiny shield against a hurricane. The walk to Millers Creek is 5 miles. Leo's thin coat is no match for the wind that sweeps across the barren field, turning his cheeks a raw, painful red. He holds the metal coffee can against his chest, the cold of the tin seeping through his clothes. He has no real plan. He just knows he has to do something. Maybe he can buy a bag of feed for the last 2 chickens. Maybe Mr. Henderson at the hardware store would sell him some of those window caulking strips. He thinks, with the desperate, flawed logic of a child, that if he can just stop the cold from getting in, he can stop the bank too. He walks with his head down, a tiny, determined figure against an endless gray landscape. He is 2 miles from town when he sees it. It is an enormous, black and chrome motorcycle pulled onto the gravel shoulder. It is not a sleek, modern machine. It is an old Harley-Davidson, a true panhead, and it looks as tired and beaten as his family's farm. It has leaked a small dark puddle of oil onto the dirt. Standing beside it is a man who seems to have been carved from the same rough material as the nearby mountains. He is huge, not just tall, but broad, a solid wall of leather and denim. He is kicking the kick-starter, his face a mask of rage, the sound of his boot striking metal echoing uselessly in the cold air. The man is the kind of person that makes mothers pull their children closer. His black leather vest, or cut, is faded and stained, covered in patches that mean nothing to Leo, but everything to a certain world. A large, menacing skull emblem dominates the back. His beard is a graying, tangled mess that reaches his chest, and his arms, visible below the rolled-up sleeves of his flannel, are a roadmap of faded blue and green tattoos. He looks less like a man and more like a warning. He is everything the town of Millers Creek fears. He is the stranger, the outsider, the visible proof of a dangerous and lawless world. This man, whose road name is Grizz, is not just angry. He is stranded. He has been riding for 3 days from the VFW post in Texas, pushing to get to a brother's funeral in upstate New York. He ran his tank dry, misjudging the distance between gas stations on this godforsaken country road. His phone is dead. Cars, the few that pass, swing wide around him, their drivers pretending not to see him. He's a pariah, a 6'4" problem that polite society prefers to ignore. He kicks the bike one last time, a roar of frustration caught in his throat. He is alone, and he is stuck. Leo should have crossed the road. He should have hidden in the drainage ditch until the man was gone. Every instinct for self-preservation, every lesson his grandmother taught him about bad men, told him to run. He did stop. His small legs froze on the gravel, but he watched the man. He watched him slump against the motorcycle, his rage fading into a visible, heavy despair. The man ran his gloved hands through his hair, and in that moment, he just looked tired. He looked the way Sarah looked at the kitchen table. He looked stuck, and Leo knows what stuck feels like. He walked forward. The sound of his worn-out boots on the gravel was tiny. The man's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing, instantly hostile. "What do you want, kid?" His voice was a low growl, like gravel in a blender. Leo flinched, but he did not run. He stood there, shivering, holding the coffee can like an offering. The giant of a man stared at him, confused. Leo's lips were blue with cold. He held out the can with both hands. "You're out of gas, sir." Leo's voice was barely a whisper. "I don't have a can, but this is for the gas. You can buy some in town." Grizz stared. He did not understand. He looked at the old, rusted coffee can. Inside, he could see a mess of crumpled $1 bills and a small ocean of silver and copper coins. He looked back at the boy. The kid's jacket was at least 2 sizes too small, the cuffs inches above his wrists. His glasses were held together with a piece of gray tape. This was not a kid giving away his allowance. This was a kid giving away his treasure. Grizz looked at the small, chapped hand offering him the can, and he felt something in his chest crack open, something that had been frozen solid for 20 years. "How much is in here, son?" Grizz asked, his voice softer now, the gravel gone. $27.45. Leo said, his voice full of a strange, misplaced pride. "I was saving it." Grizz looked at the can and then he looked down the long, empty road. $27. It would not buy a new tractor. It would not pay a bank loan. But it was enough to buy a small red can and 2 gallons of gasoline. It was enough to get a man unstuck. It was everything. And this boy was giving it to him. This was the moment, the pivot point. Grizz had been called a monster his whole life. He had been told he was no good by teachers, by judges, by the polite society of towns just like this one. He had worn that judgment like armor. But in all his 58 years, no one had ever looked at him with such simple, unadulterated, stupid kindness. No one had ever seen him as someone worth their last dollar. He was, in this instant, completely and totally disarmed. The purity of the act hit him with the force of a physical blow. He knelt. It was a slow, difficult process, his old knees cracking, the leather groaning. He brought his face down to Leo's level. The man was enormous up close, and he smelled like engine oil, leather, and the cold road. "What's your name, kid?" he asked. "Leo," the boy whispered. "Well, Leo," Grizz said, his eyes locking on the boy's, "I'm not going to take your money, but I am going to take your name, and I am going to remember it." He put his huge, tattooed, calloused hand on Leo's small shoulder. "You're a good man." Leo. Grizz did not take the money, but he took something more important. He took the offer. He saw the sacrifice. He stood up, and a new energy was in him. "There's a farmhouse a mile back," Grizz said, more to himself than to Leo. "I'm gonna go see if I can borrow a can and trade some work for a gallon of gas. You keep this," he said, gently pushing the can back into Leo's chest. "You're going to need it." Leo nodded, confused, not understanding the weight of the transaction that had just taken place. Grizz watched the boy walk away, a small, brave figure heading toward the town. He watched until Leo was just a dot on the horizon. He turned back to his bike. He was still stranded. His phone was still dead. The funeral in New York was slipping away. But none of that mattered. Grizz was a man who lived by a code. It was a code forged in the Marine Corps and hardened by decades in his club. The code was simple. You repay your debts. And he, and by extension his entire brotherhood, now owed a life-altering debt to a 10-year-old boy in rural Pennsylvania. Leo felt a strange combination of disappointment and relief. He still had his money, but he also had not solved this problem. He did not understand that he had just done something far more profound. He had just set a boulder in motion. He had no way of knowing that the man on the side of the road was the national president of the Stone Sentinels Veterans Motorcycle Club, a man who had the numbers of 2,000 other bad men in his phone, a man who, upon reaching that farmhouse and borrowing their phone, would not be calling for a tow truck. He would be calling his sergeant-at-arms. The exchange had been witnessed by no one. It was a quiet, almost holy moment on a lonely stretch of asphalt. It was a testament to the idea that true character is not what you do when the world is watching. It is what you do when you are cold and alone and you have nothing left to give, and you give it anyway. Leo's small act of pure, unfiltered, and utterly illogical kindness had just bought him an army. He just did not know it yet. He clutched his can and continued his long, cold walk into town, unaware that he had just lit a fuse. The old farmer Grizz met a mile back was wary at first, but he was also a Marine, and he recognized the Semper Fi tattoo on Grizz's neck. He gave him the gas, he lent him the phone, and he refused any payment. Grizz made his call. It It was short. It was not emotional. "This is Grizz. I'm in a town called Millers Creek, Pennsylvania. I'm sending you coordinates. I am calling a code redemption. It is for a civilian, a minor. His name is Leo." The line on the other end was silent for a beat. A code redemption had not been called in 15 years. It meant the entire club. Every chapter was being activated. The farmer asked Grizz, "What did that kid do for you, brother?" Grizz finished his call and looked out over the same gray fields Leo lived in. "He thought I was worth his last dime," Grizz said, his voice thick. "He treated me like I was a man, not a monster." He thanked the farmer, got on his bike, the sound of the engine finally catching, a deep guttural roar that filled the valley. Grizz was going to be late for the funeral, but he knew, as he turned his bike around, that he had just attended to something far more important. He had just answered a prayer that Leo had been too afraid to even ask. The 7 days began to pass, each one falling away like a dead leaf. Code Redemption Call was not a thunderclap. It was a seed. It would take time to grow. For Leo and Sarah, that time was filled with a suffocating, quiet dread. Leo had put the coffee can back in the workshop, his one attempt at heroism a failure in his own eyes. He felt the cold in the house get deeper, as if the approaching auction was physically draining the warmth from the air. Sarah stopped using the kitchen calculator. She now just sat, staring at the foreclosure notice on the door, as if trying to memorize every word, her face a pale, still mask of defeat. The next day, Leo went to school. The incident with Mark Hemmings had escalated. Mark, emboldened by his father's impending victory, felt a sense of ownership, not just of the farm, but of Leo himself. He and his two friends cornered Leo behind the cafeteria, near the humming electrical transformers. "It's almost moving day, farm boy," Mark sneered, shoving Leo hard. Leo's glasses flew off his face and skidded across the asphalt. He scrambled for them, blind and panicked, as Mark and his friends kicked them just out of his reach. They were not just bullying him, they were performing a public execution of his dignity. One of the lenses had cracked. Leo put the tape, now broken, glasses back on his face. The world was literally fractured. He did what he was told to do. He went to the principal's office. Mr. Davies, the principal, was a man who hated conflict. He was a bureaucrat in a cheap suit, more concerned with school board reports than with the small daily wars in his hallways. He listened to Leo's story, his fingers steepled, his expression one of polite impatience. "Leo, boys will be boys," he said, his voice smooth and dismissive. "Mark is a spirited kid. Perhaps you're being a little too sensitive? It sounds like a simple playground scuffle." Leo looked at the man, the cracked lens splitting the principal's face in two. "He's Mark Hemmings. His dad is," Leo tried to explain. Mr. Davies cut him off, his tone hardening. "His father is a respected member of our community. Mr. Hemmings, I am not going to entertain baseless accusations just because you're upset about other family matters." The implication was clear. Leo's poverty made him unreliable. Mark's wealth made him immune. Mr. Davies was not a protector. He was a gatekeeper for the powerful. He told Leo to get back to class and try to fit in better. The system had spoken. It had found Leo to be at fault for being a victim. That evening, Sarah made her own desperate attempt. She gathered her financial records, the neat, heartbreakingly precise ledgers of her decline, and went to the local legal aid office. It was a cramped, fluorescent-lit room above a pizza shop, run by a single, overwhelmed lawyer. The lawyer glanced at the foreclosure notice. 7 days? He sighed, rubbing his eyes. "Sarah, this is a judicial foreclosure. The bank has all its ducks in a row. They've been filing this for months. Your only option was Chapter 13 bankruptcy to force a repayment plan, but you needed to file that 60 days ago. You can't stop the auction at this point." "But it's my home," Sarah whispered, her voice cracking. "My husband, he built the porch." The lawyer's face softened with a practiced pity, which was somehow worse than cruelty. "I understand. I really do. But the bank has a secured lien. The debt is real. My hands are tied." He gave her a pamphlet on emergency housing and homeless shelters in the next county. The system, the very institution designed to provide justice to the poor, had offered her a pamphlet. It was the bureaucratic equivalent of a shrug. She walked home in the dark, the pamphlet feeling heavier than a brick, the last ember of hope in her heart extinguished. The failure was total. The school had blamed the child. The legal system had offered the widow a map to a homeless shelter. There was no one else to call. The police? There was no crime. It was not illegal to foreclose on a home. It was not, apparently, a crime to be sensitive. The church? Their pastor had offered prayers, but the church's own roof was leaking. The community, as a whole, had already turned away. This was the moment of true despair. It is not the crisis that breaks you. It is the realization that you are facing it utterly and completely alone. The next day was Saturday, 4 days until the auction. Mr. Hemmings, the bank manager, made a surprise visit. He drove his pristine black luxury sedan down the muddy, rutted driveway of the farm. He did not get out of the car. He rolled down the window, the synthesized chime of his car oddly loud in the rural quiet. Sarah, her hands wrapped in her apron, went out to meet him. "Sarah," he said, his voice oozing a false neighborly charm, "just wanted to stop by. I've got a cash buyer, a developer. He's willing to give you $500 for moving expenses if you're out by Monday. It's a generous offer. It saves you the public humiliation of the auction." Leo watched from the window. He saw the man in the car. He saw his grandmother's back, straight and stiff. He saw her shake her head. "This is my home, Mr. Hemmings." Sarah's voice was low, but it carried on the wind. "We will be here until the sheriff makes us leave." Hemmings' smile vanished. The mask of civility dropped. "Suit yourself," he sneered. "I was trying to be decent. You people always have to make things difficult. You'll get nothing on Wednesday." Nothing. He rolled up his window, the dark-tinted glass cutting off his face, and reversed the car, spitting gravel onto the porch as he left. The threat was not idle. It was a promise. The generous offer was not generosity. It was a strategic move. By having them out early, he could secure the property for his developer friend before the auction, likely in a backroom deal that skirted the edges of legality. He was not just foreclosing. He was twisting the knife. He was turning their loss into his personal profit. He saw their poverty not just as an opportunity, but as a weakness he was entitled to exploit. He drove away, confident that he had won, that the dirt farm and its difficult occupants were already his. Meanwhile, 1,000 miles away, the phone call was bearing fruit. In diners, in VFW halls, in machine shops and truck depots across the nation, men were getting the message. Code redemption. Miller's Creek, PA. For Leo, they were not men of polite society. They were men who had been called bad men themselves. They were veterans, ex-Marines, ex-Army Rangers, men who had seen the failure of systems up close in places like Fallujah and Kandahar. They knew what it meant to be abandoned by the bureaucracy you were sworn to protect. They recognized the call to arms. They began to move, not in a panic, but with the slow, deliberate, logistical precision of a military campaign. Men asked for time off work. They drained their vacation days. They emptied their rainy day jars, the money saved for bike parts or bar tabs. They gassed up their Harley Davidsons, their Triumphs, their Indians. They checked their tires, packed their go bags with spare clothes and tools. They formed small groups, packs of 3 or 5, merging on the interstates, a quiet, growing river of steel and leather flowing east. Grizz was at the head. He had attended his funeral, buried his brother, and then turned his bike south. He was riding hard, his face set like stone, against the wind. He was not just a biker. He was a man consumed by a righteous, cold fury. The image of the boy Leo, with his cracked glasses and his coffee can full of hope, was burned into his mind. It was a symbol of everything he and his brothers had fought for, the innocence that the world, and men like Hemmings, and systems like Mr. Davies, were determined to crush. The system's failure was a vacuum, and as the laws of nature dictate, a vacuum must be filled. The polite, safe institutions had failed. They had looked at Leo's problem and found it too small, too complicated, or too inconvenient. They had offered forms, pamphlets, and dismissive advice. So now, the void was being filled by something else. Something old, something primal. It was being filled by an institution that operated on a single, unwavering principle. You do not, under any circumstances, harm a child. You do not break a promise. And you always, always pay your debts. The town of Miller's Creek was oblivious. Mr. Hemmings was at his golf club, celebrating his deal. Mr. Davies was approving the cafeteria menu for the following week. Sarah was packing a single cardboard box, her hands trembling as she wrapped her husband's photographs in old newspaper. Leo was in the barn, trying to fix a leak in the roof, still trying to hold back the ocean with his bare hands. They were all all unaware of the storm gathering just over the horizon. They could not hear it yet, but it was coming. A storm of men who had been judged by society and found wanting, and who in turn were on their way to deliver a judgment of their own. They were a day out. They gathered at a staging ground, a large truck stop in Ohio, a full 200 miles west of Millers Creek. The parking lot, usually reserved for 18-wheelers, was a sea of chrome and black leather. It was not 20 bikes, or even 50. It was, by last count, 841 motorcycles. They were not a gang. They were an army. They were veterans from 3 different wars, men who had nothing left to lose, and one thing they would die to protect. They were the Sentinels, and they were waiting for the dawn. The cost was staggering. The fuel alone cost tens of thousands of dollars. The lost wages, the food, the supplies. But that was the point. The code redemption was not a request for charity. It was a demand for sacrifice. It was the club's way of proving that their brotherhood was not just words on a patch. It was a binding, living covenant paid for in gasoline, in time, in loyalty. They were spending their life savings to save a boy they had never met, all because he had been willing to spend his. Leo, trying to sleep, was awakened by a sound. It was faint, distant. He thought it was the wind or a train on the distant tracks. It was neither. It was a low, guttural vibration, a rumble. It was the sound of 800 motorcycles, 2 states away, starting their engines in perfect, terrifying unison. It was the sound of the cavalry. It was the sound of a promise being kept. He pulled his thin blanket tighter, unaware that his world and the world of Millers Creek was about to be changed forever. The flood was coming. It was Wednesday, the 10th of November, the day of the auction. The air was still cold and unnaturally clear, the sky a harsh metallic gray. It was the day the farm would die. Leo and Sarah stood on the porch, not out of defiance, but because they did not know where else to go. Sarah wore her husband's old coat, holding a single cardboard box filled with the photographs. Leo stood beside her, his small hand clutching hers. He had not bothered to put on his broken glasses. He did not want to see the world clearly today. They were just waiting for the sound of the county sheriff's car, coming to execute the final legal eviction. They heard a sound, but it was not the sound of a single car engine. It was not a train on the distant tracks. It was a vibration, a low, guttural thrum that started in the soles of their feet and vibrated up into their chests. It was a physical presence. Leo looked to the horizon, to the county road that led to town. It was just a thin gray line, empty, but the sound was growing. It was the sound of a gathering storm, a man-made thunder that was rolling, unstoppably, toward their small, doomed piece of land. In Millers Creek, Mr. Hemmings was at the Community Trust Bank, pouring his second cup of coffee. He was wearing his best, charcoal gray suit, ready for the public spectacle of his victory on the courthouse steps. He heard the sound. It was an annoyance. He assumed it was a crew from the highway department, perhaps some heavy machinery, but the sound did not fade. It grew, a deep-chested, percussive roar that rattled the coffee cup on his desk. He frowned and walked to the bank's large front window, irritated by the distraction from his day of triumph. In the school, Principal Davies was in the middle of the morning announcements, his voice droning over the intercom about a bake sale. The sound drowned him out. The students in the classrooms looked up from their desks, their eyes wide. It sounded as if a fleet of heavy bombers from an old war movie was passing directly over the building. Mr. Davies stopped mid-sentence. He could feel the vibration in the floor of his office. A deep, unsettling fear, a fear of the unknown and the chaotic, began to prickle at the back of his neck. A state trooper, parked on the overpass of the interstate 20 miles west, was the first to see the full truth. He was writing a speeding ticket when the sound made him look up. He dropped his ticket book. Below him, on the highway, was a river. It was a black and silver river, a solid 2-lane wide column of motorcycles that stretched for miles, disappearing over the horizon. They were not speeding. They were moving at a steady, disciplined 60 miles per hour. He grabbed his radio, his voice shaking. "Dispatch, I got a visual on, I don't know, 1,000 bikes? Maybe more. They just took the exit for Millers Creek." The town of Millers Creek was not built for this. The first bikes hit Main Street like the lead elements of an invading invading army. The roar was apocalyptic. The sound of 841 Harley-Davidson engines, concentrated in a 3-block radius, was a physical force. It shattered the morning quiet. It shook the glass in the windows of the diner. People poured onto the sidewalks, holding their hands over their ears, their faces a mask of confusion and terror. They looked like refugees from a bygone era, a horde of barbarians descending on their quiet, civilized world. Mr. Hemmings stared, his mouth open, the coffee cup frozen in his hand. He watched them pour past his bank. They were not the local weekend warriors he sometimes saw. These men were huge. They were weathered. They were old and young, but all of them had the same hard, unreadable expression. He saw the patches, the sea of stone sentinels rockers. His blood went cold. He was a man who understood power. He was, in that moment, looking at a form of power he could not control, threaten, or buy, and it terrified him to his core. The procession did not stop. It did not slow. It rode through the center of town with methodical, terrifying purpose. It was a display of force, a message to the entire community. They flowed past the courthouse, past the police station, and took the hard right onto the Old County Road. The town's single police cruiser, which had tried to intercept them, sat pulled to the side, its lights flashing uselessly, like a toy a child had discarded. The river of chrome and steel was flowing to one single destination. It was flowing to the farm. Leo saw them first. The sound was deafening now, the ground itself trembling. He tugged on Sarah's sleeve and pointed. A cloud of dust was rising from the county road. And then, cresting the hill, came the headlights. It was not one. It was a flood of them, a sea of white and amber lights that washed over the fallow fields. They were coming down the driveway, the small muddy track that was barely wide enough for a tractor. They just kept coming and coming and coming. They filled the yard, the fields, the road. The first bike, the massive black panhead, pulled to a stop just feet from the rotten porch steps. The man on it was a giant. He cut his engine, and in the relative silence that followed, he swung his leg off. He slowly, deliberately removed his helmet. Leo's heart stopped. He knew that face. It was the man from the road. It was the man with the gravel voice and the tired eyes. It was Grizz. He looked up at Sarah, and then his eyes found Leo, who was hiding behind his grandmother's coat. Leo, Grizz's voice rumbled, easily carrying over the idling pops of the hundreds of other engines. I told you I'd remember your name. He looked at Sarah. Ma'am, he said, with a respectful nod. We're here to repay a debt. Leo, confused and terrified, just stared. Grizz turned, faced the road, and raised his hand. In a staggered, rolling wave, 840 more engines were cut. The silence that fell was absolute. It was heavier and more threatening than the noise had been. Then, as one, the men dismounted. They did not shout. They did not posture. They moved with the silent, economical precision of men who knew their purpose. They fanned out, forming a line, then a perimeter. They stood, shoulder to shoulder, a solid living wall of black leather and denim. They stood with their arms crossed, facing outward. They were a fortress, and at the center of that fortress, on the porch, stood a 10-year-old boy and his grandmother. They had built a human wall, shielding the house from the world. Right on cue, Mr. Hemmings' luxury sedan appeared, crawling down the road. He had brought the auctioneer, a man in a cheap suit, and 2 county sheriff's deputies. His car looked small, black, and absurdly out of place. He stopped 100 yards from the new wall of men, his headlights illuminating the endless line of leather backs. He got out, his face purple with rage and a new, dawning panic. What is the meaning of this? He shouted, his voice a reedy squeak. This is a legal proceeding. You are all trespassing. Grizz did not shout. He walked slowly forward, flanked by 2 of his sergeants-at-arms, men who looked like they could tear the doors off Hemmings' car. Grizz was holding nothing but his gloves. He stopped 10 feet from the banker. This is not a proceeding, Grizz said, his voice a low, flat calm. This is a family reunion. Hemmings sputtered. Family? You are not. This property is in foreclosure. Grizz looked at him, his eyes like chips of ice. You're wrong, Grizz said. This is the property of our newest member, and we do not allow strangers at our family events. He turned back to the porch. Hey, Leo, he called out. You're with us now, son. One of the men walked onto the porch and handed Leo something. It was a small, child-sized leather vest. On the back was a single patch, property of the Stone Sentinel. Leo, stunned, held it in his hands. The threat was not a threat at all. It was a shield. The invasion was a rescue. The barbarians were an honor guard. They had not come to destroy the farm. They had come to claim it and its occupants as their own. Neighbors were watching. From behind their curtains, in houses a mile away, they saw the spectacle. They saw the bad men they had always feared, the men they crossed the street to avoid, and they saw them standing guard over the weakest, most vulnerable members of their community. They were doing the job the community had failed to do. They were doing the job the bank, the school, and the legal system had refused to do. They were standing in the gap, a terrifying, protective, and righteous force. Mr. Hemming's face was as white as a corpse. He looked at the two deputies. Do your job. Remove these squatters. The senior deputy, a man who had seen combat himself, just shook his head. He was looking at the patches, the veteran rockers, the Semper Fi and Rangers Lead the Way tattoos. That's 800 combat veterans, Mr. Hemmings, the deputy said, his voice flat. They ain't squatters. They're an army, and my jurisdiction ends right here. The auctioneer was already packing his briefcase, his face pale. I can't conduct an auction in this environment, Mr. Hemmings. This is a hostile situation. He was already backing toward his own car. The power dynamic, the one Mr. Hemmings had relied on his entire life, had been completely, violently, and irrevocably inverted. The man with the law and the money was suddenly the weakest man in the valley. The system had failed Leo, so Leo's new family had brought their own system. This is the moment that defines justice. It is not always a gavel. Sometimes it is the roar of an engine. It is not always a courtroom. Sometimes it is a muddy farmhouse yard. If you believe that true power's only job is to protect the powerless, not the predators, then smash that like button right now. Your engagement proves that this code, the code of loyalty Grizz and his brothers live by, is more important than any line on a balance sheet. Hemmings was alone. He was as isolated, as vulnerable, and as terrified as he had made Sarah feel every night at her kitchen table. The deputies were getting back. In their car, the auctioneer was gone. It was just him, his expensive suit, and a wall of men who were not impressed by his title. The flood of justice had arrived. It had not come from a judge or a lawyer. It had come on two wheels, smelling of gasoline and leather, and it had washed all his power, all his leverage, and all his arrogance away in one single terrible and beautiful wave. Hemmings did not run. He was paralyzed. He had built his life on the idea that rules and money were the ultimate power, and he was now facing a power that respected neither. Grizz took one more step, and the banker flinched. "You are done here," Grizz stated. It was not a request. It was a judgment. "You will go back to your office. You will mark this debt paid in full. You will not contact this family. You will not come near this land. If you do, we will know." Hemmings, his face a mask of sweat and terror, nodded dumbly. He got back in his car, a machine that now seemed like a fragile, pathetic toy, and reversed, leaving a plume of his own dust as he fled back to the town he thought he owned. The law had been defeated by a stronger, older code. The resolution, however, was not just for the banker. A code redemption is total. As the standoff unfolded at the farm, a separate pack of 10 bikers, led by Grizz's road captain, rolled quietly into the parking lot of Miller's Creek Middle School. They did not roar their engines. They moved with a silent, menacing grace. They walked in formation through the school's front doors. Mr. Davies, alerted by a panicked secretary, met them in the hall. "I'm sorry, you can't be here," he began. The road captain, a man with a scarred face and Marine tattooed on his neck, simply held up a hand. "We're here to see Mr. Davies about one of your students, Leo." The principal's office was suddenly very, very small. 4 of the men filled the room, their leather cuts making the air smell of the road. "Leo is our family," the captain said, his voice quiet. "We are his new advocates. We are reviewing his file. We are concerned about his safety. Mr. Davies, we are concerned about the staff's failure to protect him." Davies, his blood turning to ice, began to stammer about boys will be boys. The captain leaned in, his eyes flat. "Not anymore. From now on, you are his personal protector. Any further sensitivity will be considered a direct failure, and we will be back. We are now on the emergency contact list." The system, so immovable, had just been bent until it broke. They found Mark Hemmings in the cafeteria. The boy, so confident in his father's power, froze. The bikers did not touch him. They did not raise their voices. They simply flanked his table, casting a shadow that blotted out the light. "Leo," the road captain said, kneeling so his face was level with the bullies. "He's our brother. You understand?" Mark, his voice a tiny squeak, nodded. "We don't like people messing with our brother." The captain smiled, a terrifying expression. "This is the only conversation we will have. Go tell your father that the farm boys said hello." The bully, the boy who had inherited his father's cruelty, had just been handed a lifetime of terror. He would never look at Leo again. Back at the farm, the real work began. The crowd of men parted, and Grizz walked onto the porch. He held his helmet in his hands. He stopped in front of Sarah, who was trembling, clutching Leo's hand. "Ma'am," Grizz said, his voice now gentle, "that boy of yours, he tried to give me $27. He paid a debt he didn't owe. Now we're paying one we do." He turned the helmet over. It was full of cash, wadded up 20s, 50s, 100s. "This is the down payment." Sarah stared, her mind unable to comprehend the scene. The money was not a loan. It was not charity. It was, in their world, a simple and direct repayment. It was not just the helmet. One by one, the other men walked forward. They were not wealthy. They were mechanics, welders, and truck drivers. They were men who lived paycheck to paycheck. They emptied their pockets. They unzipped pouches on their bikes. They added to the pile. They were paying for the fuel they had burned to get here. They were paying for their lost wages. And now, they were paying the bank. The pile of cash on the old, rotten porch table grew into a small mountain. It was the physical manifestation of loyalty. It was the ransom for a family that society had discarded. Sarah broke. She did not just cry. She collapsed, a low, animal wail of grief and relief tearing from her throat. It was the sound of a person who had held their breath for years, a person who had carried an impossible weight, finally letting it go. It was the sound of a dam breaking. Leo, in his new vest, ran to her, and the two of them held each other. The bikers turned, giving them their privacy. They did not comfort. They were not soft men. They were just, in that moment, present. They were the wall that had finally allowed Sarah to fall, knowing she would be caught. Then, a new sound. The idling engines were gone. In their place was the sound of hammers, of saws, of generators firing up. The Sentinels were not just an honor guard. They were a construction crew. They were an army of craftsmen. Men swarmed the house, tearing off the rotten porch boards. A team climbed onto the roof, the sound of shingle pullers echoing. In the barn, a group of men who were master mechanics surrounded the dead tractor, their voices a low murmur as they diagnosed the problem. They were not just paying the debt. They were rebuilding the world that the debt had tried to destroy. The montage of renewal was a miracle. The rotted porch was rebuilt in solid, treated oak. The leaning silo was braced and reinforced. The dead tractor's engine roared to life, a deep, throaty sound that had not been heard in a decade. Trucks, the support vehicles that had followed the bikes, backed up to the case, backed up to the house. The wives, sisters, and partners of the bikers, the Sentinel support crew, marched into the house. They did not ask. They simply took over the kitchen, and they began to fill the empty cupboards, the empty freezer. They brought months of food, of supplies, of warmth. The town watched in stunned, shamed silence. The monsters they had feared, the barbarians who had terrified them, were re-roofing a widow's house. They were mending the fences of a boy they had all ignored. They saw their own failures mirrored in the Sentinels' competence. They had offered pity and prayers. The bikers had brought hammers, cash, and justice. They had been afraid of the men in leather, and they had never once been afraid of the real monster, the man in the suit who had tried to steal a home. The moral universe of Miller's Creek had been inverted. Leo stood on his new porch, his small shoulders squared in his new vest. He was no longer the invisible farm kid. He was a prince, surrounded by his own private, terrifying, and deeply loving army. Grizz knelt in front of him. "You keep this on, son," he said, tapping the patch. "We're family. You get stuck again, you call." He stood, put his helmet on, and swung his leg over his bike. He did not say goodbye. He simply nodded, and one by one, the sound of 800 engines returned, a triumphant, deafening roar. They had arrived as a storm, and they left as a promise. Courage is not the absence of fear, and it is not about being the toughest man in the room. True courage is seeing a stranger stranded on the side of the road and offering him the only $27 you have in the world. Courage is kindness when the world has given you every reason to be cruel. Leo video taught a brotherhood of hardened men that their strength was not for fighting, but for shielding. Share this video with someone who needs to remember that heroes exist. They do not always wear capes. They do not always follow the rules. Sometimes they wear leather, and they always pay their debts.